Okay, any matters that we need to get on the record based upon the discussions that we've had earlier this morning?
I think by agreement there were some changes on page 10, I believe, of the jury instructions regarding the use to which the jury can make of prior past crimes and misconduct that aren't contained within the ambit of specification 1. And I think an agreement was reached, the Court Council agreed to, and the court made that change. It's going to preliminarily instruct the jury before adoptions and resumes the stand on that issue. Other than that, I can't do anything.
It will be nothing further on behalf of Mr. Parker.
Okay, all right. So I will read to the jurors that portion of the jury instructions that have been discussed once they get here. All right. Mrs. Harper.
Yeah, did you want to make sure that?
Oh, yes.
It's working.
Yeah, we're good. Okay.
Thank you.
Yes, you're welcome.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, thanks. All rise for the jury. You may be seated, ladies and gentlemen. All right, good morning.
Good morning.
Once again, welcome back to Court 4B. In this mitigation phase, you've already heard evidence with respect to a prior conviction that the court considered Exhibit DB. And you've heard some testimony regarding prior criminal offenses. I'm going to read to you at this point in time the instruction that I will also read to you again at the conclusion of all the evidence, helping you to sort of see and appreciate how this evidence and testimony is to be used in your deliberations. I'm going to ask that you please listen up while I read this instruction to you. There was evidence in the second phase of the trial regarding the defendant's prior criminal record or other alleged past misconduct. In fact, specification 1 that was found by the court rather than presented to the jury is a prior conviction for attempted murder and shall be weighed as an aggravated circumstance. However, apart from specification 1, you are not permitted to consider evidence of prior convictions or past misconduct in determining whether the defendant's history, character, and background offer mitigation to the punishment to be recommended by the jury. With the exception of specification 1, Mr. Pardon's prior criminal record in other cases or misconduct may not be considered as an aggravated circumstance. Past convictions apart from the attempted murder conviction in specification 1 and other misconduct must not be considered for any other purpose. So hopefully that helps you as you're listening to the testimony that he presented, and then for your consideration at the point in time that you begin to deliberate. All right, so on behalf of the defendant.
Thank you very much, Your Honor. Your Honor, I would still like to continue the direct examination of Dr. Stinson.
All right. You can return to the witness stand and you're still under oath.
Yes, sir. Good morning, Dr. Stinson.
Good morning.
I would like to begin with where we left off yesterday.
Sure.
I believe you were explaining, and you had gotten to where you were describing the trauma that Anthony experienced. And I think we had arrived at, I think you talked about some of the early trauma, and we had arrived at the trauma that you, during your evaluation, was able to determine as far as Anthony was concerned. Could you explain to the members of the jury what you found during your evaluation?
Sure. Where we had left off is I had talked a lot about early childhood trauma and early developmental trauma, the physical abuse from the dad and the neglect from mom, the drug and alcohol problems that were in the family, the mental health problems in the family, the legal problems that ran in the family. Talked about the adverse childhood experiences and that he had 9 out of 10, and really just the kind of multi-systemic failure that he experienced going through childhood. And what I was moving into is it didn't stop in childhood. Tony experienced a fair amount of trauma as an adult too. He went, as we discussed yesterday, went to adult prison as a 17-year-old, having committed an offense when he was 16 years old. And not just any adult prison, but he ended up in a maximum security prison, Lucasville, which is the Southern Ohio Correctional Facility down in Lucasville, Ohio. And in talking about those experiences, he described it as kind of the worst of the experiences he had. Despite the childhood and the abuse he suffered then, this experience was the worst that he recalls from his life. Again, keeping in mind, he went in when he was, 5 foot 7 inches tall, 130-pound, 17-year-old. And he was living amongst hardened maximum security criminals. He talked about seeing beatings, seeing stabbings, seeing other people get raped. He himself described being beaten, being stabbed, twice being raped. He was incarcerated at Lucasville in 1993 when they had their 11-day riot, where inmates took over one of the blocks at the prison and killed 9 inmates and 1 corrections officer. So his trauma didn't stop in childhood. It continued even though in an incarcerated setting throughout his adult years in prison as well.
Dr. Stinson, when he went to a prison, at 17 years old. That was not his first contact with the legal system, was it?
That was not his first contact with the legal system.
And could you explain to the jury, did he have prior contacts with the judicial system?
He did. He had had juvenile contacts with the legal system. He had, in fact, was adjudicated a delinquent child at age 15, and then, of course, went on to commit this offense at age 16, for which he was sentenced for 5 to 25 years in prison during the full 25 years. So he had certainly some contacts with the juvenile court system prior to being bound over into the adult system as a juvenile.
Do you recall when you were looking through the records if he had a juvenile adjudication when he was 11 years old for burglary back in January of 1976?
I don't specifically recall that adjudication, but that would be consistent with the types of things he was getting in trouble with as a juvenile, starting at a young age.
He talked about some of the things that went on in Lucasville at the time that he was incarcerated in prison. You're looking at the records and viewing the records. Was Anthony at any time, or was he a model inmate? I guess that's what I'm asking you.
I don't know if there is a model inmate. If there is, he probably was not a model inmate. Tony got in trouble in prison. He wasn't a perfect inmate. He had write-ups. You know, I certainly don't want to minimize his write-ups, but anyone who's in prison for 25, 35 years is going to have write-ups. He had some that were more significant write-ups. Obviously, he went to a maximum security prison. That is an indication in itself that he was having adjustment problems in the prison setting. Of course, he was 17 years old. I know from my work with the Department of Youth Services and consulting with the adult prisons that they have their most problems with their youthful offenders, the under 25s. There's all sorts of reasons why that is, and Tony was no exception. He had significant adjustment problems, got in trouble in prison, was in a maximum security facility, and so I wouldn't describe him as a model inmate.
He had quite a few write-ups for disobeying orders.
Most of his write-ups were for what, relatively speaking, would be considered petty things: disobeying orders, being out of place, which is hanging out with people that, you know, in a cell where he's not supposed to be, or in an area where he's not supposed to be. Again, I don't want to minimize those, but in the broad scheme of prison life, those are considered relatively minor infractions. That's not to say that he wasn't in fights too. He was in fights. There are medical records that show that he got beat up. There are disciplinary records that show that he was throwing fists in fights. So he was involved in fighting as well.
Thank you, Doctor. Let's get back to your evaluation. And I believe your next slide would involve conduct disorder and antisocial behavior.
Yeah, so now we're kind of getting into, okay, this is everything that's happened to Tony along the way, the childhood trauma, the continued adult trauma, and so how did it end up manifesting itself in terms of psychological diagnoses? As a child, he would have met criteria for what we call a conduct disorder. And a conduct disorder is kind of an official way of saying he had significant behavior problems. Somebody who is appropriately diagnosed with a conduct disorder is somebody who either has a history of being aggressive and or deceitful, stealing and lying, and or destructive of property, and or violating other serious rules like curfew violations or skipping school. So there's little doubt in my mind that as a child or adolescent, he satisfied those criteria. He was in fights as a kid. He was in trouble with the law when he was a kid. He was, acting out as a kid. So he clearly met the criteria for conduct disorder. And then the question when a child has conduct disorder is that going to develop into what we call an antisocial personality disorder? And you can think of an antisocial personality disorder as an adult version of conduct disorder. And not surprisingly, Tony's conduct disorder did in fact develop into an antisocial personality disorder. And I say not surprisingly because the research shows us and our diagnostic books tell us that there are certain risk factors that if they're present, they increase the odds of a conduct disorder developing into an antisocial personality disorder. For example, if a person who has a conduct disorder suffers child abuse or child neglect, that increases the risk of the conduct disorder becoming an antisocial personality disorder. Similarly, if a person has a conduct disorder and they have unstable or erratic parenting, that increases the chances that it's going to grow into an antisocial personality disorder. And if they have inconsistent parental discipline during their childhood or adolescence, that increases the risk that conduct disorder will grow into an antisocial personality disorder. So that's why I say it's not surprising that he developed an antisocial personality disorder. The diagnostic criteria for an antisocial personality disorder is basically a person who more than once, repeatedly gets in trouble with the law, and then they exhibit other features like impulsiveness, irritability, seemingly not caring. So a person who is breaking the law like Tony did, and he shows evidence of impulsivity and irritability, that by itself is enough to meet the criteria for an antisocial personality disorder. The other feature that we can look at to see that he meets the criteria for antisocial personality disorder is the vast majority of individuals who go to prison, by definition, have an antisocial personality disorder. They have failed to follow the rules and laws of society. And then again, if they are impulsive and irritable, then they satisfy the criteria for antisocial personality disorder. So he had as a child a conduct disorder that grew into an antisocial personality disorder as an adult.
Once you had that conduct disorder as a child, is there any way to avoid that transition to an adult antisocial? I mean, is there a cure at a level where you can intercede and maybe do something to avoid that next consequence?
Yeah, so there are. Obviously, you want to avoid the risk factors. You want to avoid exposing the person to abuse and neglect and erratic and unstable parenting. The treatment of choice for conduct disorder in childhood or adolescence, the treatment of choice is what we call parent training along with family therapy. So parent training is really teaching parents how to discipline without being abusive, how to be consistent, how to be stable. You're basically training the parents on how to manage behaviors that the child is presenting with. And then a family therapy component becomes important because the general school of thought is a person isn't just born with a conduct disorder, it develops as a product of their environment and their experiences. And so as a child, you need that family unit to kind of fix underlying problems that are creating the exhibition of the behavior problems. So to answer your question, of course there were things that could have been done. The earlier you do them, the better. But we would have wanted to avoid these risk factors. We would have wanted to do significant parent training, and we would have wanted to have a family therapy component.
Through the records, it indicates, now, maybe you can help. Anthony was at some point removed from the home,
He was.
and was he placed in any treatment facilities?
Anthony was placed in some of the records will refer to them as treatment centers. I'm familiar with the centers that he was in, and if you research those centers, they really were facilities that were part of children's services, and they were temporary housing arrangements for individuals who had not been placed in foster care or for whom residential treatment was not available. So Tony was technically taken out of his parents' home and put in the care of children's services, but where he was at was really a temporary housing placement for individuals like him who couldn't get foster care or residential treatment.
So he was housed, but he wasn't ever offered any treatment that would avoid him going to the antisocial behavior.
He certainly did not get any treatment that we would expect would have interrupted this process. He certainly did not get that.
Thank you, Dr. Stinson. Going back to your evaluation.
Yeah, so again, talking about diagnosis, clearly he developed a conduct disorder, he developed an antisocial personality disorder. One of the things that people with an antisocial personality disorder does is engage in kind of reckless and irresponsible behavior. So it's very common for individuals with an antisocial personality disorder to also abuse drugs or alcohol. It's actually, in my opinion, somewhat remarkable that Anthony didn't heavily abuse drugs, because everybody in his family did for the most part. He did, however, develop an alcohol use disorder. And that's not to say he never used drugs. He did. He smoked some weed in the past, and there are certain records that say he may have tried cocaine once or twice. But his vice when it came to drugs and alcohol was alcohol. And he was using heavily when he was outside of the institutions, albeit that was a short period of time. But in that short period of time, he found himself drinking larger amounts and over a longer period of time than he intended, suggesting either some control issues. He developed a tolerance to alcohol where he needed more of it to get the same effect. He found that it was interfering with other activities. He was spending a great deal of time using alcohol or being under the influence of alcohol. And he had persistent desires but unsuccessful efforts to scale back on his use. So these kinds of things, when a person's experiencing that, that would satisfy the diagnostic criteria for an alcohol use disorder. Again, not terribly surprising in his circumstances, given the genetic predisposition for drug and alcohol abuse, given the traumatic environment he came from, given his generally maladaptive ability to cope, owing in part to his lack of treatment. So not terribly surprised, but he did in fact develop an alcohol use disorder as well.
And I believe you indicated that a lot of that has to do with the ability or use it to cope. Dr. Stinson, I'm asking you, a guy goes into the institution at age 16. He stays in custody until he's 17, and then he is shipped off to an adult prison. He spends the next 25 years in an adult prison. And then he's placed on the street without any safety net. Would that cause a person to maybe want to use alcohol to cope with that new reality that they're entering into?
Well, I think that was certainly part of the issue here. As I spent my time with Tony and talked to him about his alcohol use, it became apparent to me, even if he couldn't specifically articulate it, it became very apparent to me that he was overwhelmed trying to adjust to life in the community without really any supports, any guardrails in place, without any programming that would have prepared him for this wild adjustment that he was going to have to make after years of incarceration. So it certainly became apparent to me that part of his using alcohol was trying to maladaptively cope with this overwhelming new responsibility that he was ill-prepared to manage.
Thank you, doctor. I believe he had, or you diagnosed through your evaluation, psychological disorders?
Yeah, in addition to the conduct issues and the alcohol use disorder, he meets diagnostic criteria for a couple of psychological disorders. Most prominently is post-traumatic stress disorder. Again, at least from my perspective, not terribly surprising. This is a person who has grown up in a traumatic and dysfunctional and chaotic environment. That alone would be enough to potentially trigger post-traumatic stress disorder in certain individuals. But then he also had a prison life marred by violence, physical assaults, sexual assaults, use of weapons, a riot where 10 people were killed. So it's not terribly surprising that under these circumstances he would have developed a post-traumatic stress disorder. And the reason I say he has post-traumatic stress disorder, clearly he's experienced traumatic events that could have threatened his life or the life of others. That's a kind of threshold criteria for PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder. In his case, he saw people get beat up. He saw people get sexually abused. He himself was beaten up. He himself was raped in prison. He was stabbed in prison. So he clearly experienced these traumatic events, even if we don't think about the trauma from his childhood. In addition to experiencing the traumatic event, because not everybody who experiences a traumatic event is going to go on to develop PTSD, but in addition to experiencing that traumatic event, in reaction to things that remind him of the traumatic events, he has emotional reactions. For example, he was just talking about when he was in jail and a nurse kind of went by and it reminded him of his experience from Lucasville. And I remember him talking about, I don't know why, but it made me angry and I just couldn't get out of my mood. Well, he's not going to be able to articulate, that's a classic sign of PTSD, but I know as he's telling me that's a classic sign of PTSD. He's having a trigger that reminds him of past traumatic events and it impacts negatively his mood state. That's kind of a classic sign or symptom of PTSD. I asked him about some of the traumas he's experienced, and he said, I don't really talk about it. It's, I just try to let it be in the past. Again, he's not going to say, I don't like to talk about it because I have PTSD. But as a psychologist, I know that people who have experienced traumas who have PTSD often avoid conversations and try not to consciously think about those past experiences. They want them. They try to avoid. They try to cope through avoidance, and that's what he was doing. He talked about dreams that he's had and nightmares that he's had, and just how things pop up in his head, which I would refer to clinically as intrusive recollections. So all his descriptions and his mood states in response to these traumatic reactions are predictably developed into a post-traumatic stress disorder. In addition to the PTSD, he's had a fair amount of depression. In his case, and this is not uncommon for males in particular, his prominent mood is not sadness per se, but it's irritability. And the predominant mood in a depressive disorder for adolescents and for males actually is irritability, anger, in part because of how people males in particular, are socialized to cope with their emotions. They identify it as anger rather than properly labeling it as depression. But he clearly has had a prominent mood state of irritability, oftentimes in response to things that have happened in his past. He's had a life full of unstable sleep patterns. He doesn't sleep very much, which is consistent with PTSD and depression. He's had problems at times kind of focusing and thinking because he's ruminating on negative ideas. Again, something that's common in depression. So he met diagnostic criteria for PTSD and for major depressive disorder. And then he's had at different points in times panic attacks in the past. Those seem to kind of come and go depending on certain situations that are going on. That's less of a chronic issue with him than is the depression and PTSD. The depression and PTSD have been ongoing for a long period of time, largely untreated, so they persist to this day.
I believe you indicated that under the 4 childhood doctors, did Anthony have opportunity to be treated by any childhood doctors that you can find in your records?
I didn't see anything that indicated he was ever treated. He's had evaluations done. And I reviewed yesterday some of the recommendations that came out of those evaluations, and I cited to that when I talked about this multisystemic failure, that these evaluations were done, the recommendations were made, but then nobody followed up on him. He didn't get the intensive counseling. He didn't get the residential treatment. He didn't get the psychiatric care. He didn't get the sex offender treatment, either in prison or in the community. He didn't get the close supervision that he needed. He didn't get the gradual reintegration into the community and adjustment. So I saw that evaluations were done and reports were written, but I never saw that actual treatment occurred.
Thank you, Doctor. Moving on to the next step in your evaluation.
Yeah, the last thing that I mentioned diagnostically was potential brain damage. Again, I'm not a neuropsychologist, so I don't do assessments of brain damage per se. I'm certainly not a neurologist, so I can't read X-rays and MRIs and PET scans. But there's reason for us to be concerned that this is a person who has brain damage. First of all, the literature tells us that capital defendants who are facing potential death penalty, are disproportionately more likely to have brain damage. And that might stand to reason that people who have brain damage do certain things that get them in situations legally where they're facing the death penalty. So that just at the outset, we should have an increased sensitivity to the possibility of some type of brain damage in cases like this. If we look specifically at Tony, he talked about being born with bumps. I don't know, I have no idea what that means. It may be perfectly normal. It may have been indicative of something that went on in utero. We know that his mom was young. We know that she abused drugs and alcohol. So I don't know if this description of being born with bumps is some indication that he was exposed to toxins in utero. Drugs or alcohol could certainly contribute to being born with brain dysfunction. I don't have the birth record, so I don't know what to make of that. But even without knowing that he was born with bumps all over him, we know his mom's history. We know her age. We should be concerned that there is potential for toxin exposure in utero, which could, of course, contribute to brain dysfunction. We know that from a very early age, he had what was diagnosed as ADHD. And maybe it was ADHD. Maybe it was hyperactivity, impulsivity, inattention, distractibility. And that's all it was, ADHD. But maybe it was something else. When I see kids at very young ages exhibiting significant behavior problems, I think you have to at least consider and rule out that there could be some type of brain dysfunction. We know that, or I know, and I'll share with you, that he boxed. He boxed when he was on the streets. He boxed in prison. Twice he reported being knocked unconscious. We're starting to have a much better understanding of what happens when people have multiple concussions and how that can impact brain functioning. The medical records from prison talk about him being assaulted in the head, talk about him having post-concussive headaches and blurred vision. These are all suggestions that there could be some type of brain dysfunction going on. In 1986, he, in prison, was hit in the back of the head with a baseball bat, requiring stitches. I mentioned earlier, he was stabbed. In fact, he was stabbed in his right ear when he was at Lucasville. The records show that he's had these migraines, or what have been documented as post-concussive headaches, and he complained of memory impairment relative to how he perceives his memory used to be. So all of these things lead me to be concerned about brain dysfunction. Now, there's at least one report when he was, I think, 17 years old that said he didn't present with any organic brain dysfunction. However, that same report pointed out that he had learning disabilities. He had functional dyslexia and a math disorder. So the learning disability is another reason. Maybe it doesn't get picked up as organic brain dysfunction on a particular test, but it's another indication that something's not going right with his brain. So I put that in as something that could not be ruled out based on my evaluation, would need further exploration from a neuropsychologist and or a neurologist.
Dr. Stinson, were you able to, after doing your evaluation, reach any conclusions as far as Anthony Pardon was concerned?
Well, certainly I concluded obviously that I think there are a number of mitigating factors in the case, which I presented throughout. I concluded that he had a conduct disorder that developed into a personality disorder, a substance use disorder, and then significant psychological disorders. I didn't conclude that he had brain dysfunction, but I was not able to rule that out, and I think that needs to be considered as a real possibility in this case.
Doctor, I'm going to direct your attention to your next slide. And is there tell the members of the jury what the slide represents.
Well, this is a kind of, the slide you're seeing right now is my effort to link the mitigation findings to the negative outcomes. This is based on this model, this visual that you're looking at, is a model that's based on work that was first put out by a researcher and practitioner named Mark Cunningham, and he's written a lot in the area of capital defendant evaluations. In what this visual depicts, it tries to take the research that I have been citing to, and it visually shows you how it's relevant. And so what you're looking at is
Just let me stop. Would it help if I gave you a pointer?
I may have one here, actually. I think I do, so I will use that to
Sorry,
maybe.
I didn't mean to interrupt you. I'm sorry.
That's okay, I appreciate you suggesting that. I think it could be helpful. So what you're looking at here is you've got Tony is the person we're talking about. And you could put anybody here. You could put me, you could put you, we could put any single person here. And what we're hoping to get, this is what the literature tells us we need for healthy development. What we're hoping to get is a person who is born into and raised on a very strong, healthy foundation. And that strong, healthy foundation includes the absence of drug and alcohol problems in one's family, the absence of psychological problems in one's family, and the absence of developmental abandonment or instability. So just on day one, what we want to give any person the best chance at developing in a healthy way and being productive and avoiding negative outcomes is that we raise them on a really strong foundation. And then if you look back at the research that I was citing to yesterday, that research is telling us if we do the right things, we create a protective wall. We are protecting individuals in their development from negative outcomes. And what the research tells us is the types of things that need to be in place to protect them are ideally an intact and healthy family, acceptance and affirmation in their early developmental years and in the environment that they're growing up in. We want stability and structure and consistency across their lifespan at home, in schools, wherever they are. We hope to model positive values both in the family and in the schools and in the neighborhoods. And we want them to develop positive peer relationships because individuals will always have their choices. But what influences decision making and the choices that all of us make are to some extent the stability and the foundation on which we were raised and the level of protection that was in place for us. That's not to say that if all of these things are in place, we can't end up with negative outcomes. We can have a strong foundation and we can have a sturdy and healthy protective wall. And a person can still develop psychological problems and drug and alcohol problems and criminal activity, but it's a much bigger hurdle for that person, right? It's a much bigger hurdle. In Anthony's case, what we see is he did have developmental abandonment and instability. And so the way we think about that is his foundation very early on was cracking. And not only that, but there's a strong family history of psychological problems. So we take away that and the foundation is becoming even more unstable. And in his case, there's a really strong history of drug and alcohol problems. So he is born into a cracked foundation. And when you add those three things back, you say you have an individual who early on experienced developmental abandonment. Early on, lots of instability and dysfunction in his home and in his environment as his brain is developing. He's experiencing that. He's being raised by a mom whose bipolar disorder is not adequately managed. He's in a household that normalizes drug and alcohol abuse. It's as if we have put him on a skid, a downhill skid towards problems. It's not to say it's unavoidable, but the cards are kind of stacked against him right now, and the trajectory is to negative problems. So then we start asking, okay, we don't have that strong foundation. We don't have that healthy foundation for him to be raised on. Do we have at least an intact family? And in his case, we don't have the intact family. So the protective wall is starting to be stripped away. Did he get acceptance and affirmation? He got just the opposite of that. He was physically abused and emotionally abandoned, if not physically abandoned. So we don't get the acceptance and affirmation. Again, our protective wall is starting to be stripped away, brick by brick. We're realizing he's going to be left with only his choices without the protection of these other things. He didn't have stability. He had absolutely no stability. He didn't have stability at home. He didn't have stability in the neighborhood. He didn't have stability at school. He didn't have stability when he was placed in institutions and in the correctional facilities. As an adult, when he got into prison, there might have been structure, but early on in his life, there was no structure. Family members will tell you it was chaos. It was dysfunction in our home. So he didn't have the structure. He didn't have the consistency. He didn't have modeling of positive values. We don't even have to look toward his friends. His parents and his siblings have all been to jail or prison and abused drugs. Not some of them. All of them have been to jail or prison and have abused drugs. So he doesn't get the modeling of positive values. He doesn't develop positive peer relationships. He's actually being taken out of this dysfunctional home, and he's being put with other kids who have conduct disorders, who can't find foster homes, who aren't going into residential treatment. And then as a late adolescent, he gets bound over in the adult system and he's going to maximum security prisons with hardened criminals. So he doesn't have the positive relationships either. What he's left with are his choices. And we can't take that away. He definitely had choices. He made horrible choices over the course of his life. He made horrible choices that leave us here today. And so we won't strip away his choices. He did have choices. But what this model illustrates is that although he has choices like other people, he's extremely disadvantaged by not having a healthy foundation and by not having a protective wall. He's left with choices that are almost inevitably going to result in problems. Psychological problems, drug and alcohol problems, criminal activity and violence. And so, if you then think about adding other emotional or damaging corruptive influences, those ACEs that I was talking about yesterday, those adverse childhood experiences, not one or two or three, like all of us might experience, right? 2/3 of the population has at least one of those adverse childhood experiences. Not that uncommon. But 2 or 3, now it's starting to be a little bit of an issue, but some of us will experience that. 4 or more, and now we've got, it's as if we're not just on a downhill skid with no protection, but we got people pushing us from behind, or influences pushing us from behind. He had 9 of the 10 adverse childhood experiences. And so this moves his choices to a place where it's almost inevitable that we're going to see a negative outcome in this case. We're going to see the development of psychological disorders, as we did. We're going to see the development of substance use disorders, as we did. We're going to see criminal activity, as we did. So this model, I think, visually illustrates what I was talking about yesterday when I say this is why these childhood experiences, and this is why the research is so relevant, because it put him on an unstable foundation with no protection in place and negative influences pushing him toward negative outcomes.
Based on your evaluation, and there's no surprise that you're here testifying in this phase of a trial for Anthony Pardon.
Could you say the question again? I missed the first part of what you were saying.
You're not surprised, based on your evaluation, that you're here testifying today and yesterday on behalf of Anthony Pardon, are you?
Right, from a psychological standpoint, I don't want to say that it, we're going to end up in a death penalty case, but from a psychological standpoint, when you kind of pull the curtains back and you look at what he's experienced, this model tells us we can't be shocked that this ended negatively, it ended tragically. But that's what's going to happen if we give all of these things in one person's life. You might be able to overcome abandonment and instability if you got some other things in place. You might be able to overcome family members who have psychological disorders. Many families have parents with psychological disorders. Now, oftentimes they're well managed, but even people who come from families where the mental health problems aren't well managed, they can come out okay, right? Lots of families have parents who unfortunately struggle with drugs and alcohol. Lots of families, half of them, end up not being intact. There's separations or divorces. So any one of these things by themselves, even 2 or 3 of them, then maybe we say, okay, people are resilient, they overcome these problems. But in this case, we're missing everything. We're missing everything we needed, and we added on everything that we didn't need, and the systems that were involved kind of failed him or us, however you look at it, and we end up here. So from a psychological standpoint, do I look back and say, oh, this is surprising? I'm sad to say, no, I'm not surprised that this ends up tragically.
Now, let me ask you this. Do you subscribe to the theory that if a guy goes into prison, say age 16 or 17, and he does, say, 25 years. Do you subscribe to the theory that when he gets out, he really hasn't matured, and you're really probably dealing with a person who, psychologically, according to society, is probably still about 17 years old?
Well, certainly there's this concept of arrested development, that you stop developing when certain things happen in your life. Arguably, you could say, look, he had arrested development earlier in his childhood when he was experiencing a bunch of trauma, and he failed to kind of progress in terms of moral development, in terms of physically, obviously, he developed, but in terms of moral development and adopting values that our society holds, that probably arrested or stopped long before he got to prison. What I subscribe to is when you put somebody in prison at age 17, and the only environment they've really experienced up until that point in time was a dysfunctional one, they now have a worldview that is dysfunctional. They don't get to go from a healthy home to prison and say, whoa, that was a huge contrast, don't want to go back there. His home environment with the abuse and the illegal activity and the drug and alcohol and the lack of caring and consistency, that got further modeled for him in prison. What I worry about when you take somebody at 17 who had his experiences and you put him in prison, particularly a maximum security prison with hardened criminals, and you keep them there for 25 years, and then you let them out with essentially no programming, no supports, no guardrails in place. Not just that he comes out as the 17-year-old who went in, you gotta predict he's gonna come out worse than when he went in. And I believe that's exactly what happened here.
Your Honor, can I have a minute, please?
You may.
Dr. Spencer, thank you very much. I think you've been very helpful. I believe that Mr. O'Brien may have questions for you.
Thanks, Mr. Thomas.
Thank you.
Cross-examination.
Thank you, Your Honor. Please report, Mr. Thomas, Ms. Dixon. You issued a written report in this case, did you not, Dr. Stinson?
I did. I produced a relatively brief report based on what I had at that time, yes.
If I may approach the witness, Your Honor.
You may.
I have here that's been marked in this case as a state's exhibit because it was not marked as a defense exhibit. State's exhibit EE, and ask you if that is a report dated January 6th of this year that you produced.
Yes, this looks like my report.
Okay. Thank you. And in that report, you relate the information available to you for purposes of testifying in this case.
Yeah, what I did is essentially provided a summary of what I anticipated presenting at that point in time. And I think you have the report in front of you. You'll see I mentioned at that point in time there were a lot of things I didn't have, so my evaluation obviously was ongoing at that point. Ongoing as of today, actually, because I was still reading things last night.
Right, and this is dated January 6th of this year.
That's correct, yes, sir.
And tell us when you first saw Anthony Pardon in the county jail after this crime.
Sure. I first saw him, if I can refer to my report, first saw him on July 27th, 2018. So about a year and a half ago was the first time I ever met with him.
Doctor, I have your report on page 4 of 9 at the top under observation and examination of Anthony Pardon. It says you first saw him on July 12th.
I'm sorry, I was looking at the wrong section of the report. July 12th, 2018. Yes, sir. You're correct.
So what you said a minute ago isn't right, correct?
I said July 27th. That is actually a different part of my report when I met with his attorneys. I met with Tony on July 12th, 2018.
And that would be almost 6 months after the crime in this case, correct?
I believe that's accurate, yes.
And you met with him for 3¼ hours.
That's also correct.
The next time you saw him was 3 months later or thereabouts, October 16th of 2018.
That's correct.
And that would be 8 months after the crime.
That sounds about right, yes.
And you didn't see him again then for, it looks to me like a year and 4 months or so. You didn't see him again until January 4th of this year, 2 days before the report you issued. Is that correct?
That's correct, and if I may make one correction, and again, I apologize. My report says I saw him on January 4th. I actually saw him on January 5th. That's a typo. January 5th was a Sunday, which is when I went in to see him. So there's actually a typo in my report. But your point continues to be correct, that there was that much time before I saw him for my final visit.
And did you just notice that typo right now?
No, I noticed it actually when I was preparing. I had handwritten notes that said 1-5, and I noticed my report said 1-4, and frankly I thought, oh shoot, I'm never going to be able to figure out which date's correct. I went back to my calendar and I saw it was on my calendar for 1-5.
Okay. And that would total about 7½ hours you met with the defendant in connection with your report and your testimony?
It looks like that's correct.
When did you create this 70-page PowerPoint that you showed to the jury yesterday and today?
I created it on Monday.
Monday this week, holiday that we were off.
I wasn't off, but yes, it was Monday.
Well, neither was I, Doctor. But
appreciate it.
so you created this item Monday of this week.
I did.
And among the records that you reviewed, did you see a report that the psychologist did before the juvenile court bound him over for trial as an adult?
Which report? Are you referring to Dr. Smith's report?
Yes.
Yes. I was given that report yesterday after my testimony, and so I reviewed it last night.
And this was
And I should clarify, the copy I was given was illegible, probably about a quarter of it. So I reviewed to the extent I could, based on what I could read off the copy that I was provided yesterday.
And that's the, as you understand it, the offense that is the specification number 1 in each of the 5 counts the jury's considering punishment on, correct?
As I understand it, that's correct.
And isn't that the first psychological report among many that was done on Anthony Pardon?
I'd have to look at my notes to know if that was the first. He was 17 years old. There may have been some probation reports, things like that before, but that very well may have been the first psychology report that was done on him.
And did you see any psychology reports before this report that's dated December of '81?
I'll be honest, I'd have to look at my notes to know with certainty the chronology. As I testified to yesterday, I got on Saturday evening a disc with about 3,000 pages of records. Ordinarily, I would kind of have those outlined in chronological order. I just started going through them when I got them. So I know there were some more reports. As I sit here right now, I can't tell you which one happened first or second.
Okay, you work in the system, correct?
How do you mean?
Yeah, you testify in cases like this?
Oh, sure.
You work at DYS?
I used to work at DYS. I left there about a year and a half ago.
You're familiar with the bind-over process for juveniles to be bound over for a charge in juvenile court for trial as an adult, aren't you?
Sure, I do bind over evaluations. I have a contract with this court to do bind over evaluations.
And in this case, you did not seek what you knew existed, a psychology report to bind him over for trial as adult on this underlying offense on spec 1? Is that what you said?
Oh, no. Let me back up, make sure I'm clear. I was confident it existed. In fact, I had asked for a lot of records, and there's still records that I know exist that we don't have, such as the Children's Services records. So there's no doubt in my mind it existed. I just didn't have it. Now, maybe I got it Saturday evening, and it was buried in the 3,000 pages of records I still haven't gotten all the way through. But it was actually handed to me yesterday after my testimony and said, this is going to be talked about tomorrow, so if you haven't read it, you need to read it, and that's what I did.
And Doctor, when you visited Anthony Pardon on July 12th of 2018, going on a year and a half ago, you knew he'd been bound over for trial as an adult on a prior case, didn't you?
I did.
And you did not walk to the building next door and ask for the bind over psychological report? Is that what you're telling us?
No, what I'm telling you is that I ask, when I do these evaluations, the way the psychologist gets the records is to make a list and request it through their attorneys or their mitigation specialist. I can go over the list of records I've requested that I don't yet have. There are a lot of records that I think are probably available that I don't have. This was one of them.
And this psychologist, when he examined Mr. Pardon, did a number of psychological tests, did he not?
He did do some psychological tests, yes.
He did 6 or 7 of them, correct?
I don't know if I'd say 6 or 7. He used what we would call some instruments that would not be considered tests, but he certainly used at least several tests. I remember he gave an intelligence test, he gave an achievement test, and then he used some, what we would refer to as projectives. So he did do some testing, and then he also used some additional instruments.
And are you familiar with the Bender Gestalt test?
I am.
Did he give that test?
He did.
And does he note on page 2 of the report that that test indicated the defendant had no organic brain damage?
I believe, I don't have the report in front of me, but I believe what he indicated was that based on the Bender Gestalt, there was no evidence of organic brain damage. There are other places in the report where he does in fact talk about deficiencies on certain brain functions, and in fact he diagnoses learning disabilities.
But nowhere in this report otherwise does he say he had organic brain damage.
No, what he does, he describes deficiencies of certain brain functions, but he doesn't use the word organic brain damage. He just describes what parts of the brain were deficient based on the testing he did.
And what testing did you do in that regard?
So, as I said, I didn't do testing. I recommended actually that a neuropsychologist be involved in this case, and that we consider neuroimaging being done, because I feel strongly that there's a high chance that there's some brain damage. I don't do neuroimaging. That's not my area of expertise. I'm not a neuropsychologist. So I made the recommendation. It wasn't done in this case.
Did you do a Bender Gestalt test?
No.
But this doctor did.
I think back then the Bender Gestalt was probably a good test. I suspect most people won't use the Bender Gestalt today.
He reached a conclusion after that test there was no organic brain damage, correct?
I don't think that's a fair conclusion.
Hold on one second. Overruled.
I don't think that is the conclusion. I can pull the report, but my reading of the report was that the Bender Gestalt did not show evidence of organic brain dysfunction. He goes on in his report to talk about what the other tests showed, and they did in fact show deficiencies in certain brain functions, and indeed Dr. Smith diagnosed learning disabilities based on those results.
May I approach the witness, Your Honor?
You may.
Dr. Stinson, I asked you to look at page 2 of this report from Dr. Psychologist Smith. The first paragraph on the second page, I have some area underlined there. Could you read that for me?
Sure. It says, Bender Gestalt test results indicate no organic brain damage.
Other items in that sentence?
Brain syndrome or hypokinetic reactions.
So he concluded back then, based on the test that he gave, that there was no organic brain damage, that there was chronic brain syndrome or hyperkinetic reactions, correct?
I think that's an I think that's an incorrect characterization of that report. What he said, and I'm going to try to be clear about it, he said that particular test showed no evidence. If you read the report as a whole, he clearly described certain areas of the brain that had deficiencies. So I want to be clear that he clearly says, based on the Bender Gestalt, there's no evidence. But he does not conclude that overall there is no evidence.
Yet nevertheless, he does not say anywhere later in the report that he has organic brain damage. Is that correct?
Well, he diagnosed more specifically learning disabilities, which are a type of disorder. So he got more specific with his diagnosis at the conclusion of the report. The organic brain damage would be kind of a global, I don't see on this test anything going on. Then as you read through his report, he talked about other tests that had deficiencies here, deficiencies here, deficiencies here, and then he specifically called it a dyslexic reading disorder and a math disorder.
And that's what he called it, but he did not say that there was organic brain damage. Will you please admit that, doctor?
I think I have admitted that. I try to be very clear about that. That he didn't call it organic brain damage, he called it a learning disability.
Did you see among the records you reviewed a 1999 report, I believe, a psychological evaluation done by Dr. Dennis Eschball?
I did see that report, and I remember that one specifically because I know Dr. Eschball.
You know Dr. Eschball, correct?
I do.
He has an office here in Columbus, correct?
I know he works in Columbus. I don't know where his office is or if he works out of his home, but he does work here in Columbus.
And he apparently was working at ODRC in December of 1999, correct?
It would seem so from his report because he was doing a pre-parole evaluation.
And this is a psychological evaluation that DRC does whenever someone comes up for parole, correct?
That's my understanding, yes.
And there were many reports like that in the prison records, weren't there?
I'll have to take your word for that. I didn't see many of them. I tried to find what I could. I found a couple. If there are many, then I'm a little bit behind the eight ball because I haven't been able to review 3,000 pages of records in 48 hours.
And you didn't ask for those in July of 18 after you saw this man, correct?
Oh, no, I think that's incorrect. I think I could probably show you documentation that I was asking early and often for records in this case.
Okay. And when you saw this report of Dr. Eschball, did you call him at his office here in Columbus to ask him about his examination of the defendant?
I did not talk to Dr. Eschball about his examination. I'm not sure he would even remember from 1999, but I have not talked to him.
He signed the report that you saw, didn't he not?
I believe he did. I'm sure he did, but I don't specifically recall that as I sit here, but I'm assuming he did.
Do you recollect seeing in his report that Mr. Pardon had been declared a sexual predator?
I did see that.
Was that a finding under the Adam Walsh Act?
I believe it was. Yeah, I believe what happened is after his conviction, the law had changed, and then they had a hearing to determine whether or not he would be labeled and need to be a registered sex offender. And I believe that they determined that he was.
And when he was released from prison in, 2006, he failed to register as a registered sex offender, correct?
That's correct. I believe he moved to Georgia and failed to register there and received a new charge down there for failing to register.
In connection with the fraud that you mentioned yesterday?
Yes, sir.
And did 10 years down there for those 2 low-level felonies?
That's my understanding of the record, yes.
And from your familiarity with these kind of cases, the defendant was sentenced to 5 to 25 at ODRC when he was 17, correct?
That's correct.
And he did that full 25, didn't he?
He did.
How often do you see someone who's eligible for parole in less than 5 years do the full 25?
But I guess 2 parts to that. I don't think he was eligible for parole in less than 5 years. But it tells me something if someone got a 5 to 25 and they did the full 25. It tells me that what I know now from the records, that he had some adjustment issues early on, and eventually he was frustrated and stopped going to the parole board meetings, and you're not gonna get paroled if you won't meet with the parole board. But he also, I understand, stopped going to the parole board meetings in large part because they told him, you won't get out until you get sex offender treatment, and he couldn't get sex offender treatment in prison. So he felt defeated and thought that it was a kind of a waste, that he was never gonna get out.
Well, doctor, did you see where the defendant refused sex offender treatment when he was in prison?
I didn't see that. If he did, then I did not see that. What I did see was that he was requesting, at least at one point, sex offender treatment. The mental health department wrote a letter to the board saying he has in fact been asking for sex offender treatment for years, but that they don't offer it. They didn't offer it at the institution he was at. And I saw a kite from his mom. A kite is kind of like an informal way of communicating with prison personnel, asking for treatment. So if there was a time when he refused treatment, I could believe that if you show it to me in the record. I didn't see it. But I do know that there were times where he clearly was asking for treatment.
Did those records also reflect that both psychologists and prison personnel believed that Anthony Pardon was someone who was untruthful when he described events?
I don't recall specifically seeing that, but I think that's a fair characterization.
Your information that you've testified about here today, in large part, relies on what Anthony Pardon told you, correct?
What I've tried to testify to today is stuff that's consistent between what he told me and what I was able to corroborate from what records I did have and what family have informed me of. Now, it's true that part of any evaluation, I believe, is going to result or be based at least in part on self-report. I don't think there's much, if anything, that I've testified to that wasn't corroborated by other sources as well. There may be. I don't want to draw a line in the sand and say I didn't report anything that was based just on what he told me. But there was a lot of convergence between what he told me and what I was able to get from the records and from other sources.
And what police reports did you find or review that found he had been assaulted by his parents within the household?
Well, that wasn't a police report. That was from Tony and his sister and his brother and his mother. All four of them reported that.
So him and his family told you something happened, and you have no police reports to corroborate it. Is that correct?
That's fair. I don't even know if a police report exists. Oftentimes, domestic violence does not result in a police report, particularly back then.
And regarding other conduct or misconduct in the home, I understand from what you said earlier, you do not have children's services records that confirm some of the things that the defendant, his mother, sisters, and others told you.
That's correct. Those records were requested. A letter came back from Children's Services saying, based on the order that was provided from the judge, they had nothing they could release. I don't know if that means they don't have any records or if they didn't have authority to release it based on the order they received. I know with a fair amount of confidence he was at Children's Services and they probably have the records, but for whatever reason they wouldn't release them for this case.
I think the answer is you had no children's service records that confirmed the reports of him and his family.
That's correct. Other than their letter, I had no Children's Services records, unfortunately.
Did you look at the court file on the bind over to adult court in this case?
I looked at as much as I could that was in the 3,000 pages of records that I got on Saturday night, and some of what I looked at did involve the court proceedings from the bind over. Can I represent that I looked at everything? I don't know, because I haven't been through the entire record yet.
And he was bound over for trial as an adult on that case because, as you told Mr. Thomas, he had frequent appearances in juvenile court before that attempted murder, rape, and kidnapping, correct?
Yeah, I think the ultimate decision to bind him over was they didn't believe that he would be rehabilitated in the juvenile justice system.
And that's because he had been there since age 11, first with a burglary, correct?
I think that's a fair statement. Now, why the judge ultimately decided to bind him over, all I know from the report is because they determined that he would not be amenable to treatment in the juvenile justice system.
He had been there for assault, correct?
I don't know that with certainty, but I certainly can believe that.
Menacing threats.
I could believe that too.
He in fact had another rape in juvenile court as a minor, didn't he?
He did.
That he was not bound over for trial as an adult. He was kept in the juvenile court system for rehabilitation purposes, correct?
That is correct.
And then when he got his second rape at age 17 with an attempted murder and kidnapping, that's when he was bound over for trial as an adult.
I think his second rape, he actually was 16, and then he was bound over when he was 17.
Let me approach the witness. Dr. Eschbaugh, in his report, Dr. Stinson, on page 3 addresses the issue that I mentioned in this paragraph I'm pointing to. If you would look at that and see if that refreshes your memory on Mr. Pardon's willingness to engage with sex offender treatment.
Sure. He indicated that he previously wanted sex offender programming but was denied access, and that now it may not be relevant if he is going to serve his full sentence. He indicated that he did not necessarily need sex offender programming, that he was in control of his behaviors, and if he didn't want to do something, he would not do it.
Now, this is in '99, probably about the 5th time he was eligible for parole when he is refusing sex offender treatment, correct?
I don't think he said I don't think he refused. I don't think it was offered and refused. He said he previously asked for it. He wasn't given it, and now he's not going to do it and not sure he needs it.
And he didn't feel he needed it because he could control himself in that regard?
Yeah, I think that's a very common reason for people not to engage in treatment, is they think that they're now in control because they're in a structured setting and they're not acting out.
Well, and during the full 25 years he was in prison, he only attended one program, correct? 1995, Cage Your Rage.
He did attend Cage Your Rage. I remember seeing that one.
Did you see any others?
I think there was a couple of things. Maybe one of them was educational in nature. He certainly went to more than one. I don't remember. And I should acknowledge, he didn't go to very many. So I'm not suggesting that he was like enrolled in programs, day after day. He went to Cage Your Rage, and I think there was some educational piece or something that he did.
Well, don't they offer many programs where inmates can go to make themselves have a good picture of themselves when they come up for parole hearings?
I know they do now. I'm sure they did back then.
The other reports that occurred back during this original time frame, and in fact, the very first thing they do when someone goes into prison, isn't it they classify them, decide where they're going to go?
Yeah, they'll do an initial classification, and they have reclassifications periodically.
And he was originally sent to the High State Reformatory at Mansfield, which at that time was to incarcerate prisoners under 25, correct?
I'll take your word for that. I don't know that with certainty.
Yeah. Did he go to Mansfield on his first commitment?
I believe he did, yes.
Yes. And in the classification process, do they ask about the family background and other things?
If you want to show it to me to refresh my recollection, I don't know as we sit here. Typically, classifications, at least the reclassifications, are looking at, your age, whether you've been in trouble recently, how much time you have left. They're basically trying to figure out, what level institution you should be in. And it's typically based on those types of factors. What the initial classification had in it back then, I don't know, but if you want to show it to me, I'd be happy to look at it.
Well, I guess my question was, do they ask about family and background in the classification process?
I'd have to see the form to know. I don't know.
Have you looked at these kind of records before?
Sure.
It's SOP, Standard Operating Procedure. An inmate comes in, they ask about family background. Isn't that correct, Doctor?
Not necessarily in a classification instrument.
Excuse me.
Sorry.
Dr. Sampson? Yes.
Okay, let's approach. Excuse us, ladies and gentlemen. objection is sustained. Good rephrase.
Dr. Stinson, I have something identified as family history from May of '82, which would be approximately the time of the first classification by the defendant that asks about family history. That item familiar at all to you?
Not particularly.
Is there a question on there or a comment regarding family, drug, and alcohol use?
There is a comment on here about that.
And tell us what that is.
It says denied past or present alcohol or drug problems in family.
And that would be the defendant when he's first classified, correct?
That is not a classification instrument. I don't know when that instrument is filled out.
May 26, 1982, within several days of his arrival at the prison.
Yeah, I guess I'm just saying I don't know that that's part of the classification process.
Okay.
I don't doubt that it was filled out then. You keep saying it's part of the classification. That's not a classification instrument.
And either that report by the defendant about his family history is untrue, or what he told you recently is untrue, correct?
I think we can say with good confidence that that's not accurate. We know that from the legal records and from family reports.
And I asked you earlier, aren't these records replete with falsehoods by the defendant to prison officials, psychologists, and parole board members?
I don't doubt that some of the information he's provided over time is inaccurate. In fact, some of it's inconsistent, so some of it has to be inaccurate.
And I think my point is you're relying on him when he gives you information in your 3 meetings at the jail.
Well, as I tried to clarify, it's not solely based on his report. I do my best to corroborate and look for convergence of information from multiple sources.
Does the parole board, when someone comes up for parole, seek the input of psychologists, psychiatrists, victims, investigators, judges, and others?
I know that they ask for a pre-parole psychological evaluation as it relates to all the other folks you mentioned. I don't know that for sure.
Now, Mr. Thomas asked you a question about were you shocked that we're here today, given what you found in his background, the defendant facing a capital murder indictment, and you said you were not at all shocked?
What I hope I said and what I meant to say is I'm not shocked that we had a tragic ending, that we had a negative outcome. Of course, any capital case is shocking, but from my perspective as a psychologist, when I look at everything that I reviewed with you all, I can't be surprised that we have a negative outcome here.
Did you see in records throughout his prison records similar expressions that we would be here many years later with this kind of case?
Yeah, and I think that's exactly why I say we had this multi-systemic failure. The third grade teachers and the counselor said the writing was on the wall. Psychologists said the writing was on the wall, and yet we released this person without treatment, without guardrails. So yeah, there was references in the records, and that's part of what I'm talking about.
If I may approach the witness, Your Honor, to refresh his memory. I have from October of 1983, only about a little over a year after he was in prison, when he had a pre-parole summary sent to relevant people. Is that similar kind of opinion expressed in 1983?
Approach again.
Yes, you'll please approach. Excuse us, ladies and gentlemen. The objection's overruled.
Thank you, Your Honor.
You may inquire.
And I think, Doctor, I inquired about a document contained within the prison records that appears to have recommendations regarding the defendant's parole. Does that appear to be that kind of a document?
This is a document that's asking the opinion of the judge, the prosecutor, and the detective on whether or not Anthony should be paroled at this point in time, in 83.
And that was in 83?
Right.
And did the...
Well, some of it's from 82, but I think the part with the detective that you're talking about is from 83.
And is that what the detective thought in 83, consistent with your view that you testified about here today, about how we ended up in this courtroom?
I'm not sure I follow the question.
Well, what did the detective say?
So this report says Detective James, interviewed on the date above, which is 9/15/83, stated he felt subject should serve his full 25 years, as he feels subject will be back through the system again. Subject exhibited no conscience, I think they probably meant conscience, and may kill his next victim.
And is that the kind of handwriting on the wall piece you referred to that the teacher expressed?
Yeah, I think this is a part of the multi-systemic failure. Is that it was identified early on, as early as 3rd grade. Then when he was 12, 15, 16, 19, and people are saying, we just let him out without doing anything, without providing services, without treating him, without putting him on close supervision, that will end up with a negative outcome, and here we are.
And the defendant, throughout the time he was in prison, got transferred from Mansfield to Lebanon. Did you see that? Another correctional facility?
I saw that he was transferred to several facilities. I don't specifically recall Lebanon, but I'm sure I can believe that was one of them.
And he was transferred from Lebanon to Lucasville, correct?
At one point, he was transferred to Lucasville. I know that was certainly where he came from. I don't know.
And weren't these disciplinary transfers based on his misconduct? They're not just transferring him around from prison to prison, were they?
Some of them absolutely were disciplinary, but not all of them were. Some of them were for his own protection and things like that. But some of them, of course, were for disciplinary reasons, but not all of them.
I may approach the witness, Your Honor.
You may.
This document, Dr. Stinson, was among the prison records that I received. Did you see that document?
If I may, I'll just read it real quickly and see if I recall seeing this before.
Sure.
I do not believe I've seen this before.
Can you tell us what it is?
Sure. It's a letter from William Dahlman, who's the superintendent at Lebanon Correctional Institution, to Roger Overberg, who's the chief of examination and classification, regarding a request for a disciplinary transfer of Anthony Pardon.
May I see that, Judge?
Yes, you may.
All these documents, Your Honor, that I'm asking about Dr. Stinson about, I gave to Mr. Thomas yesterday.
Yes. Okay. On or off?
On.
Excuse us again, ladies and gentlemen. As always, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your patience. All right, you may inquire.
If I may approach the witness,
Yes.
Dr. Stinson, this letter dated February 14th of '84 was among the prison records. I think you testified a second ago that you don't believe you saw it before.
Correct.
Okay. After having seen that document, isn't it true that the defendant was transferred from Lebanon to?
Again, Your Honor, I'm going to object.
No, I'll overrule the objection as to the question that's on the table right now.
Isn't it true that the defendant was transferred from Lebanon to Lucasville at the warden's request?
This is the request. I can assume that it was granted, but this doesn't say it's granted. This is just the letter requesting the transfer.
And the request from the warden gives the reason for 17 disciplinary infractions within the past year, correct?
Correct.
Yeah, I think he's asking my client to read it. Can I point, Your Honor?
Yes, I think you get the same answer. Excuse us again, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you once again, ladies and gentlemen, for your patience. There's a point that we're trying to get to, so if you can just be patient to get to that point, then we'll break the lines. If you want to hang it. Okay. All right, you may inquire.
Thank you, Your Honor. Dr. Stinson, do you understand that the superintendent or warden of Lebanon requested a disciplinary transfer of Anthony Pardon to Lucasville because of 17 infractions within the preceding year?
That's my understanding from this letter.
Okay. Thank you. Among the various infractions, did you see them documented in the prison records that you reviewed?
I did.
Did you see that he had possessed weapons in his cell?
I saw that on one occasion, yes.
That was a knife, correct?
Pardon me?
A knife?
Yeah, I think it was something that was made into a knife-like device. It wasn't an actual knife, but it was made into a sharp object.
Was that the incident where a shiv was found in his cell?
Where what was?
A shiv?
Yes.
Okay, and tell the jury what a shiv is.
A shiv is an object made into a sharp object to resemble a knife.
Did you see among the disciplinary actions in those same prison records that he had set a mattress on fire in his cell?
I did not see that.
Did you see that he had been engaged in misconduct by fighting while in prison, and that was among the infractions?
I did see that, yes.
And I think Mr. Thomas inquired about disrespect of the officers that were there.
Yes, I saw that as well.
Did you determine the total number of these disciplinary violations he had when he was in prison?
I did not total them up, no.
Would it surprise you if that exceeded 50?
Over 35 years, and given the general record, that would not surprise me, no.
And people with disciplinary records.
Your Honor, I'm sorry. May the jury be excused?
Oh, no, we can go ahead and break for lunch at this time. Okay. Let's get you back here. We'll say a quarter till 2. Okay. Again, remember the admonitions that I've given you with respect to discussing testimony among yourselves or with anyone else. All rise.
Thank you.